Chapter 5, Police Management, Part 4. In this particular PowerPoint presentation, we're going to focus on one particular management innovation of the last 30 years or so, 25, 30 years, and that's CompStat. And so really CompStat is two different things. On the one hand, it's pretty mundane in the sense that it's just basically a platform for solving problems. It's kind of like problem-oriented policing. So if you remember the problem-oriented policing in the CRIM model, scanning, analysis, response, assessment, it's very much similar to that. So at one level, and we're going to study that first, CompStat is essentially a way to study problems. But CompStat as a management tool was used by the New York City Police in the 1990s to really encourage police to set goals, set objectives, and to meet them in a concrete way. And so we're going to take a look at that, and that's the more revolutionary use of CompStat. And unfortunately, most revolutions fail, and CompStat wasn't very successful, and we're going to talk about why it wasn't very successful in New York. But let's first take a look at the more mundane aspect of CompStat, which is that problem-solving tool. CompStat stands for Compare Statistics. And so it's essentially very much like problem-oriented policing, but it's kind of the nerd version of problem-oriented policing. It's very heavily dependent on statistics and data. And so we have these principal elements of CompStat, and again, they're going to look very much like the CRIM model in problem-oriented policing without having that acronym. And so what CompStat's creators realized was, even 30 years ago, there were a lot of statistics that were available to police officers. But they were often relying on some of the worst ones. They weren't really using all this information that they had available. And so the first element of CompStat is the use of timely and accurate information or intelligence. So instead of just using the uniform crime reports that come out, every 6 months, every year, that come out, they're not very detailed, and by the time they come out, the problem that they're describing is maybe a year old or 6 months old. And so it doesn't really tell us what's happening right now. And so with computers, with software, with now having laptops right in the patrol cars, even with smartphones, police can access data instantly. As soon as somebody makes an arrest, it can go into some data bank and the police officers can have access to it, unless for some reason it's restricted because it's very sensitive and top secret. But otherwise, they have it. So let's use it. So we want really accurate, we want really timely information intelligence. We may have to go out and proactively seek it, so we may have to go out and gather the information, gather the intelligence. But a lot of it is already available, so police officers, again, when they make an arrest, it goes right into the system. We want that information available to everybody. Once we have that information, we want to problem solve, and we want to have rapid deployment of resources to attack the problem. So after we do an analysis of the problem and figure out what is causing it, we've identified it, maybe a computer even identified it to us. The computer software went through all the data that was being entered in and saw, hey, we're experiencing a spike in auto thefts. You wouldn't have even noticed it if the computer program hadn't brought it to your attention. It brings it to your attention. You now do some analysis. You figure out why it's occurring, where it's occurring. Is it only in one part of the city? Is it all across the city? Is it only one type of car? What is going on with these auto thefts? And once you have a good handle on it, then you need to respond to it. And so the response should be rapid. It shouldn't be that we're going to take 10 years to debate it, because by then the problem has changed. We need to rapidly deploy the resources. We want to employ effective tactics. So let's brainstorm. Let's figure out what would work the best to solve this problem. Think outside the box. And we want to employ it. And then once we employ our response, we want to constantly follow up. So here we have it even listed as relentless follow-up, non-stop. Even though it's our baby, we created this response, we can't be so attached to it that we're not willing to recognize that it doesn't work anymore. Now you have to realize that these things can constantly change. I mean, it may not be that there was a problem in the response, maybe the problem has changed. And so I think when we talked about problem-oriented policing, I might have mentioned it, that when we're talking about high-stakes crimes like terrorism, the terrorists are constantly adjusting to what law enforcement and intelligence do. I mean, the classic example would be the IRA, the Irish Republican Army terrorist group back in the 1970s and 80s. They were some of the best bombers in the terrorism world. And so what they would do is they would set up a bomb, tell people, they'd set it up in a bar, for instance, and then they would phone in and tell the people to get out of the bar. You might say, why would they do that? Did they want to blow up? No, they didn't want to hurt the people in the bar, but they wanted to blow up the bomb so that the police, the police and the military who were in Northern Ireland, the British, when those folks rolled in to investigate the bombing, when they responded, those were the people they really wanted to kill. And so then when the police and the military would come in to investigate the bombing, then the IRA would set off another bomb. Well, the British soon figured out that they were setting it off by radio control. And so there was a terrorist somewhere watching, and as soon as the police came, the terrorist would hit the remote control, and with radio frequency would send the signal to the bomb, and the bomb would go off. So the military and the police got smart, and they started sending in radio jamming trucks to disrupt the signal. They figured out, hey, there's probably another bomb here. Let's prevent that signal from being sent. Well, the terrorists adapted to that, and they used photo sensors, like flashes on a camera. They used those to set off the bomb. So go ahead and send in your radio trucks, because we're not using radio frequency controlled remotes. We're now using light sensitive remotes. And so then the police and authorities adapted to that. So you constantly have to be following up. Well, CompStat can allow you to do that through looking at your statistics, looking at the data, trying to figure out what is it really telling you. Well, New York took it a step farther. So William Bratton, the police chief who came in the 1990s, brought CompStat to New York. And what he said was, we need to run the police like a business. We really don't hold the police accountable. If you think about it, how do you know if your police department is doing a good job? You probably haven't given it much thought. As long as they show up in a reasonable time when you call them and they're polite and respectful to you, you probably think, they did a decent job. As long as your newspaper isn't saying, scandal hits police department, you probably think they're doing a good job. When Bratton said this isn't good enough, I want them to set objectives and I want us to achieve them. So we're going to say, we're going to lower the number of muggings by 10% this year. And so we're going to measure that and we're going to achieve it. So it's like a business. How do we measure the success of a business? Usually by whether they made money or not. Well, police aren't trying to make money, but they're trying to solve social problems, criminal problems, those kinds of things. So Bratton said, I'm going to set objectives, and if we're not meeting them, people are going to lose their jobs or at least lose their positions. We'll take them out of their leadership positions and we'll put new people in. And so there was not only, we're going to give them rewards if they achieve their goals or exceed them, but there wasn't just the carrot, there was also the stick. You could lose your job under CompStat, maybe not lose your job completely, but you could be taken out of command if you were a precinct commander and you weren't reaching your objectives. So Bratton held weekly meetings with precinct commanders where they would come in, and the idea was the precinct commanders would come in and discuss problems that were affecting their precinct. So what are some of the crime issues? We'll look at the data, we'll rely on word of mouth. What are some things that we're seeing in our precinct? And then the precinct commanders were expected to get together and brainstorm about this and come up with ideas. Maybe you had a precinct commander who'd already dealt with a similar problem. And so here's what we learned about it. And so they were supposed to discuss these crime trends, set goals, and what kind of progress they were making. And they were supposed to be really critical of each other. So be constructive, but be critical. What have you done about this problem? Or here's your solution that you proposed. It's never going to work because of X, Y, and Z. And so it was really supposed to have a little bit of an edge to it, so that people were really expected to come into those meetings and be prepared. But what happened was, because their jobs were at stake, they acted oftentimes in their own self-interest. So the precinct commanders were being held responsible by Bratton and his top deputy commissioners. the precinct commanders were supposed to hold the patrol officers responsible to them. So it was supposed to be like a trickle down, that everybody was going to be accountable because they were going to be accountable to the next highest person in the chain of command. Well, the problem is when you start making people worried about their job, they often act in their best interest. And so they'll act out of self-interest. And so you can kind of figure what might have happened. That when these precinct commanders realized, because they saw people getting reassigned, I mean, it actually happened. You had precinct commanders that lost their jobs, lost their positions, because they didn't reach their goals. So instead of going for these really tough social problems, what they often did was they kind of found a safe approach. They found a middle ground. They didn't take on the very easiest problem in the precinct because that would be obvious. But they didn't reach for the hardest problem, because the hardest problem meant that they were probably not going to be able to figure it out. And if they couldn't figure it out, they couldn't get the results that were expected of them, and they might lose their command position. And they might be assigned to some desk job out in the middle of nowhere that they didn't want to be doing. And so what they did was, kind of as a group, without really conspiring actively, but kind of just it was human nature, they took on the less risky problems. They also wanted to make sure at least some of the commanders, many of the commanders who weren't so honest, who were more concerned about their jobs than actually solving the problems, they also faked the data. So you have some newspaper reporters who've done some investigations, and they've gotten former precinct commanders to admit, yeah, we made up the data. We either just completely made it up out of thin air that, well, during the last 6 months we've reduced the number of muggings by, as measured, by 20%, and they completely made it up. Or maybe they made up, they just changed the way they policed to make the data look good. So they weren't policing to be effective, they were policing to make the data look good. So you might ask, well, how is that being done? Well, if I'm at the beginning of studying something and I know I'm going to be graded on how well I reduce that problem, well, in the first 6 months, I'm going to have, let's say the problem I'm tackling is street prostitution, I'm going to tell my patrol officers to go out and arrest every street prostitute they can find. So at the beginning of the study, at the beginning of my plan, there are 1,000 arrests that are being made a month. And now, as we progress through the plan and I implement my response, which I really don't, but I'm making it up so that I look good at these meetings, well, all I have to do is tell my officers, okay, don't make any more arrests of street prostitutes, or make a few. So now we have 1,000 arrests a month at the beginning, but now because I've called off the dogs, I've told the police officers not to arrest anymore, maybe we're only getting 50 arrests a month. So now it looks good. I reduced it. When in fact there may be just as much street prostitution going on the streets. And so you have all these problems. Fake data. You have data that's manipulated. You have all kinds of problems. And so looking back on Comstat and the New York Police Department, I would say, yeah, okay, Bratton had generally a good idea. Let's hold the police more accountable. Let's have them set goals, and let's have them commit to those goals and try to achieve it. And when they don't achieve it, let's have them explain it. But we also need, which Bratton didn't really do, and this is why Comstat didn't do so well in New York, we need to account for human nature. If people are going to be afraid that they're going to lose their jobs if they don't produce instant results, they're not going to take risks. They're going to be operating in a safe area where they know they can produce some success, but they're not really solving the big problems. So if we really want them to solve the big problems, we need to go back to that quality management that we talked about in the last PowerPoint, and we really need to give them room to make honest mistakes. We need to be tolerant of it and give them the time to really work out these problems. So just like in a really good football team, we give the coach time. We don't expect them to win right away. We give them the time to set up their system, get their system working, and have patience with them. Those are probably those organizations that actually allow their coaches to do that are probably the ones that are most successful over the long haul. The ones that demand instant success are usually the ones that never achieve it. And the same could be true for police. We need to give those commanders time to achieve success.